A sliver from the province between stars crossed the heliosphere, and every instrument felt the pressure of its meaning, because the object that astronomers catalogued as 3I Atlas behaved as if probability itself could be persuaded to part like a curtain. The first nights were a braid of cold air domes over mountaintop domes and downlink chirps from sleepy dishes, but the data woke fast. A hyperbolic orbit with a surplus of speed that could not be domesticated by the sun, a light curve with stubborn asymmetries, and the faint breath of volatiles tracing chemistry not native to our local family. It wasn't the fact that it came from away, that mystery is almost expected now. It was the signature of decision. Minute deviations accumulated near predicted dust lanes, as though the visitor read an invisible relief map etched into the vacuum, slipping between micrometeoroid threads with timing so uncanny it made the statisticians quiet. In the soft blue of pre-dawn, someone said the dangerous thing out loud. If a stone can move like it knows, perhaps knowing is sometimes written in stone. We learned its number before we learned its nature. The Atlas survey flagged it. Cross-checks spun up across arrays from Mauna Kea to La Palma, from Subaru's Retina to Pan-STARR's Wide Field Hunger, and within hours a dozen time series laid bare the cadence of its flicker. Its speed, an excess beyond escape at tens of kilometers per second, was the autobiography of another star's gravity well. It carried the pale signatures of carbon chains and oxygen-bearing ices that whispered comet, but its geometry contradicted caricatures. It didn't tumble like a debris shard. It precessed with a composure that spoke of mass distribution, not entirely chaotic. We watched the solar wind finger its ion wake, and we saw the wake answer with a poise that suggested charge and shape were conspiring. The object, if naturel, was a masterpiece of accidental aerodynamics in a medium so thin we normally ignore it. The object, if not, had a pilot whose hands were mathematics. In the silence between exposures, the great question always returned, what kind of universe are we living in if intention can look like physics and physics can look like intention? Observatories love patience, so we built a patient portrait. Photometry mapped brightness against rotation until we could infer a body elongated enough to stage glints without committing to a slab or spindle. Spectroscopy gave us the faint grammar of volatile outgassing, including cyanogen's ghost and CO's steady sigh, while radar, when it had the leverage, painted an absence as useful as presence, a cross-section less than expected for the reflected power, as if we were dealing with something light for its silhouette. The motion itself was a confession in ciphers. Its hyperbolic excess hinted at an origin beyond the Kuiper margins, and its approach vector, once refined, refused to align with any star known to have lost comets in that window, as if it had come from the generic dusk between suns rather than a named foyer. Near the radiance of seasonal micrometeoroid streams, our models predicted dust density peaks, but the visitor's track braided through those peaks with skater's grace. Our error bars shrank. The coincidences did not. Instruments made for dispassion began to sound like poetry in the nightly logs, a tone that sometimes signals the moment science feels the floor tilt. The anomalies were not loud. They were insistent. A cometary nucleus jetted by sunlight should pivot and twitch according to the stochastic dance events. Yet here the microcourse adjustments aligned with our modeled dust sheets, not with the naive thermal map of the nucleus. Non-gravitational acceleration showed up, but in pulses that looked like choices, minute boosts perpendicular to predicted micrometeoroid trajectories, as if avoiding sand in a storm. Solar radiation pressure can push on low-density structures, yes, and photophoretic forces can shove dusty surfaces in subtle ways, but the timing was the riddle. Avoidance patterns occurred seconds to minutes before the densest grain crossings. Was it anticipation baked by delay in our predictions? Or did the object possess a sensorium more local than our catalogs? Static charge whiskers reading the oncoming grain plasma, a sheath of ionized gas stiffening like the nape of a wary animal. We tested for bias and saw it stare back unblinking. Once you subtract the temptations of fantasy, you are left with a very narrow bridge. Either coincidence stacked itself like dice showing sixes, or the visitor carried physics that, while natural, looks like foresight from our vantage. Speculation is not a sin when it is disciplined. One camp argued for outgassing orchestrated by a topology that mimicked guidance, a fractal network of vents opening into cavities that behaved like baffles, turning thermal noise into thrust vectors correlated with dust gradients, a sort of comet brain made of pores and ice. Another camp polished light sail fantasies until they reflected a little too perfectly. If 3I Atlas were a relic of sailcraft, its area-to-mass ratio would need to be high, its composition exotic, its orientation cunning, yet the spectra resisted the prettiest alloys. A third camp went deeper into plasma. Picture a body accumulating charge in the solar wind, carrying a transient magnetosphere 40 meters thick, such that Lorentz forces on its ion tail acted as actuators, letting it lean against the wind to sidestep oncoming dust. And then there were the unlicensed dreams that somewhere, someone, or something had learned to solve the Hamilton-Jacobi equations with the zeal of weather forecasters surfing manifolds of least action with a sensitivity that feels like will. We kept the dreams on a leash, but we did not shoot them because sometimes the leash leads you to a real door. Coincidences began to arrange themselves like beads, and the string they threaded felt deliberate. On the night Jupiter's magnetotail swept past a region where our lines of sight would have suffered geomagnetic noise, 3I Atlas cruised through a corridor bounded by two micrometeoroid filaments whose peak densities were out of phase by just enough to open a temporary window. Solar wind streams staggered by coronal holes lapped at the heliosphere like tide against breakwater. And within those tides, the visitor traced a path that kept its coma quiescent, as if minimizing sputter. Even the phase angle of sunlight cooperated. Specular flare opportunities that would have revealed more shape features came and went like the glint of a distant mirror that somehow never quite catches your eye. Reasonable people will tell you that given enough passages and enough parameters, some alignments will look staged, but there is a flavor to chance that statisticians in private admit they can taste. This tasted like choreography, learning itself in real time. Gravity never stopped being the steadiest narrator, and in its voice the story grew more intricate. The sun wrote the long sentence. The planets added punctuation. Resonant terms crept into the margin notes. Within the restricted three-body problem of sun-object Jupiter, invariant manifolds, those ghost roads threading space, offered temporary corridors by which a nimble traveler could borrow and repay velocity like a careful thief. 3I Atlas flirted with these contours, not enough to alter fate, its outbound hyperbola survived, but enough to steepen the conversation. There are ways for natural bodies to leak momentum into and out of their spin via outgassing, coupling rotation to translation so that the right jet at the right longitude acts like a pilot light. There are ways for plasma sails to bloom and wither in the wind, trading charge for drift. Between such ways, the object navigated a crossing of dust lanes with fewer impacts than the baseline models expected, which is another way of saying it dodged, though the verb makes some physicists wince. Dodging in this context can mean reading gradients with a fidelity we have not yet built into our autopilots. The most human moment was the blackout. For 37 minutes during a handover between tracking networks at the edge of twilight and telemetry capacity, the signal-to-noise fell below the threshold and our eyes closed. Weather cooperated with the gap, geometry sharpened it, policies about sun avoidance angles sealed it. When the arrays reopened, the object had executed a small but useful transverse adjustment that left it better insulated from the next dust maximum. In the calm morning meetings that followed, suspicion wore a lab coat. Had we missed a burst of outgassing? Were our dust maps too coarse? Did some terrestrial interference mimic a silence that never was? The logs were clean. The sun was quiet. It was merely the blind spot between our clocks, the seam in a quilt sewn by committees across time zones. If you were writing the screenplay of an intention, you would place the move there. If you were writing the scripture of contingency, you might place it there too, because the universe often uses our habits as camouflage. If we allow ourselves to be altered by an encounter, what should we become? One clear lesson is that trajectory literacy belongs on the same shelf as spectral literacy. Our probes and telescopes have trained us to read light with exquisite subtlety. Perhaps the next art is to read motion, as if motion were also a spectrum. The way a body filters micrometeoroids, the way it leans into plasma gusts, the way it harvests minuscule gravitational curvatures, these can be signatures of composition, structure, and, in daring hypotheses, agency. Engineers sketch vehicles that will practice this literacy. Magnetospheric sails, whose fields can be tuned like instruments. Electric sails, unraveling kilometers of charged tethers to feel for headwinds in the solar wind. Photon sails that trim by degrees to ride pressure nodes predicted by heliophysics forecasts. A spacecraft that learns to braille the gravity around it could cross the solar system with a canny thrift formerly reserved for birds navigating thermals. And if a wanderer like 3i Atlas is purely natural, then nature herself has already authored the manual. We merely need to become literate. There is also a social gravity to such events. Each outsider that skims our neighborhood presses on our shared idea of the possible, and the pressure can either deform our consensus or reshape it into a wider vessel. We should build a network of perpetual sentries, small heliocentric sentinels with wide field eyes, plasma sniffs, and dust counters distributed like the seeds of a dandelion across the inner system, so that blackout seams shrink and our maps of micrometeoroid weather gain resolution. We might pair those sentries with interceptors that need no heavy propellant tanks because they sip from the environment, plasma sails to turn, photon sails to accelerate, superconducting loops to exchange whispers with the solar wind. An AI trained not merely on images, but on dynamical fields could become a new kind of navigator, one that treats invariant manifolds as living rivers and dust lanes as reeds. Ifs to be respected. If life has voyagers in the dark between stars, these would be the skills they cultivate, and cultivating them ourselves might be the most modest way to join the conversation. The future that unspools from this meeting can be pragmatic and extravagant at once. Pragmatic in that every gram of micrometeoroid avoided is a gram of mission risk shaved away. Extravagant in that the philosophy of motion itself begins to look like a language that can be spoken with more verbs than we knew. Perhaps in a generation we will send emissaries not to the planets only, but to the interstellar lanes where such visitors cross, way stations at the heliopause where the sun's breath thins into interstellar weather, ready to flag, photograph, and pursue with a fluency in fields instead of brute impulse. Perhaps we will learn to cool and unfurl films so thin they negotiate with photons, to grow magnetic bubbles that curl and unroll, to steer by gradients as surely as sailors steer by stars. The payoff is not only faster travel, it is the intimacy of being able to feel, truly feel, the fabric we have been treating as silent. And then there is the old question, fresher now. If 3i Atlas is merely a stone with clever scars, then nature has once again outwritten us. If it is a relic shaped by minds, then minds have been where we are going. Either conclusion seeds courage. For the naturalist, the mission is to reproduce the tricks, laboratory ices carved into labyrinths, plasma tunnels built to test Lorentz steering, dust chambers where filaments mimic the zodiacal bands of space. For the dreamer, the mission is to listen for pattern. Is there a cadence to the visitors, a grammar to their dodges, a reason why some never glint and some glint too much? We can aim listening posts at the quiet end of the spectrum, hunt for neutrino murmurs from outgassing jets, watch for polarization signatures that betray thin films. We can prepare questions the way mathematicians prepare lemmas so that when the next wanderer arrives, the proof has fewer unknowns. However we tally the ledger, the presence of an interstellar path traced with such parsimonious grace haunts the imagination. It says that the void has textures we have not cataloged, and that moving well is a kind of intelligence regardless of who or what performs it. It suggests we may replace some propellant tanks with knowledge, some armor with anticipation, some brute force with rhythm. In classrooms where planetary science is taught, perhaps there will be a module called choreography, not as a metaphor, but as a calculable skill, equations that treat dust as a weather system and magnetic fields as tactile surfaces. Our children may come to think of space not as cold emptiness, but as a sea with currents, reefs, tides, and winds, where a vessel that listens travels farther than a vessel that shouts. So we end for now with an image, a sliver from the deep between stars gliding through the sun's breath, threading its way between invisible bullets with a serenity that looks like faith. Telescopes blink, antennas hum, data accumulates and refuses to be indifferent. Whether we witnessed a cometary cathedral finding its own way by the laws of heat and charge, or a crafted instrument conducting the orchestra of fields, the lesson is the same. The universe welcomes those who learn its grammar. We will answer with craft that borrow from sail and magnet, from calculus and nerve. We will plant eyes where we have been blind. And when the next visitor writes its trajectory across our sky, we will read it not as a mystery intruding upon ignorance, but as a sentence in a language we have finally begun to speak. Clear, difficult, beautiful, and endless.